The 10,087th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, and Mr. Ramesh Rasachingam, Director, Humanitarian Sector Division, Head and Representative of the Office for Coordination and Humanitarian Affairs in Geneva. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. The start of the new year has brought no peace or even respite to Ukraine, but renewed fighting and devastation. Large-scale aerial assaults by the Russian Federation against civilians and civilian infrastructure across the country have resulted in horrific levels of destruction and suffering. As temperatures plummet far below freezing, the Russian Federation has intensified its systematic attacks targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The strikes have killed and injured scores of civilians and deprived millions of Ukrainians of electricity, heating, and water for prolonged periods. The impact of these attacks is felt hardest by the most vulnerable, the elderly, children, and persons with limited mobility. They follow a well-established and deeply troubling pattern. Attacks escalate when weather conditions worsen and people's need for heating becomes most acute. In one of the most recent large-scale barrages overnight between 8 and 9 January, the Russian Federation reportedly launched 242 drones and 36 missiles against Ukraine. In Kyiv, at least 4 people were reportedly killed and 25 others injured. A paramedic rushing to provide emergency medical care was among those killed, reportedly by a so-called double-tap strike. Energy facilities and multiple residential buildings were damaged, leaving nearly half of the city and hundreds of thousands of residents without heating. The embassy of Qatar was also damaged. That same day, areas in the western Lviv region near the Polish border were reportedly targeted by a Russian intermediate-range ballistic missile, the so-called Oreshnik. This would be the second time the potentially devastating weapon has been fired at Ukraine since 2024. The Oreshnik system is believed to be capable of carrying nuclear weapons, which has heightened concern over its deployment. According to Ukrainian authorities, the strike damaged gas distribution pipelines, raising additional concerns about risks to critical civilian infrastructure. Also on 8 January, 2 foreign-flagged civilian vessels were hit by Russian drones in the Odessa region. On 17 January, Russian strikes in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions reportedly left more than 1 million people without running water or heating. In Kryvyi Rih, 17 people, including children, were reportedly injured when missiles and drones hit residential buildings and other civilian infrastructure. And in the Odessa region, 2 people were reportedly killed and 8 others injured in an attack on 2 ports. Cooking oil storage facilities and containers were damaged. Odessa was hit again yesterday. This was the latest in a highly concerning escalation of strikes targeting Ukraine's port infrastructure and commercial shipping. In recent weeks, civilian casualties and extensive damage to critical infrastructure have also been reported in Kherson, Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. In total, since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that at least 14,999 civilians have been killed, including 763 children, and 40,601 civilians injured, including 2,486 children. The actual figures are likely higher. OHCHR's monitoring mission in Ukraine has just reported that 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians since 2022. Mr. President, inside the Russian Federation, local authorities continue to report civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure resulting from alleged Ukrainian strikes. We are seeing additional reports of escalating cross-border attacks on Russia's oil and energy infrastructure, some of which reportedly resulted in civilian casualties and damage to civilian and residential facilities. In Belgorod Oblast, local authorities reported that 600,000 residents were left without electricity, heating, and water after Ukrainian strike on 9 January. The authorities also reported the use of drones targeting Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod regions on 10 January, which left 1 person killed and at least 3 other people injured. Due to lack of access and limited public information, the United Nations is not in a position to verify these reports. Mr. President, we reiterate the Secretary General's strong condemnation of all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Such attacks violate international humanitarian law. No matter where they occur, they are unacceptable, unjustifiable, and must stop immediately. Mr. President, as hostilities intensify, the situation at Ukraine's nuclear sites remains extremely precarious. On the night of 3 January, Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, lost power from one of its high-voltage lines due to hostilities. Over the past week, the team of the International Atomic Energy Agency at the site has reported a significant increase in military activity in the areas surrounding the plant, including explosions heard close to the facility. These events are extremely alarming. The IAEA continues its efforts to establish temporary ceasefire zones in the areas around the plant to allow for essential repair work to ensure its safe and secure functioning. We urge both the Russian Federation and Ukraine to engage constructively with the IAEA and to immediately cease any military activities near the plant in order to reduce the risk of a catastrophic accident. Mr. President, in just over a month, we will mark 4 years since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war has brought untold suffering to the Ukrainian people, killed an unimaginable number of young men of both countries, caused global economic dislocation, and sown instability in the region and beyond. The damage it has done to the international system is still being measured. The war should never have started, and it must stop. We commend the efforts of the United States and all others concerned who are working towards peace. We urge all involved to sustain this vital work, including through concrete steps to de-escalate, stop the ongoing attacks impacting civilians in Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and establish clear parameters to end this devastating conflict. We reaffirm the Secretary General's repeated calls for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire as a first step towards a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace grounded in respect for international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. Any peace in Ukraine must fully uphold the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The United Nations remains ready to support all meaningful efforts toward this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. DiCarlo for the briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingam.
Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity to update the Council on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Since our last briefing on 9 December, the plight of civilians has grown more desperate as large-scale attacks continue to push energy systems, emergency services, and the very means of winter survival to the brink. As just outlined by Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, multiple regions across the country were struck on 8 January, causing civilian casualties and widespread disruption to electricity, heating, and water supplies with temperatures of -10 degrees Celsius and below. In Kiev, authorities reported several civilian deaths and more than 20 people injured in the attacks. Among the victims were health workers and first responders assisting those affected. One health worker was killed, while 5 rescuers and 4 health workers were injured after coming under repeated strikes. Since the start of the year, the World Health Organization has reported 11 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, resulting in 2 deaths and 14 injuries. What makes these attacks especially devastating is that they cripple the systems that keep civilians alive during winter. Power, heating, and water infrastructure have been repeatedly struck in major urban areas, including Kiev, Odessa, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Kryvyi Rih, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without electricity, heating, or water for prolonged periods. With winter conditions intensifying, each damaged substation, heating pipeline, or pumping station triggers cascading failures that put even more lives at risk. In Kryvyi Rih, families are melting snow for washing and cooking. They're also heating water over candles after power cuts lasting more than 1 day. In Kiev, more than 1,200 heated safe spaces are operating, and state emergency services and our humanitarian partners have established an additional 68 heating points in the most affected neighborhoods, offering people a place to warm up, charge their phones, and reconnect with loved ones and amid blackouts. Mr. President, civilians continue to be evacuated under dangerous conditions. Continued hostilities and repeated strikes on residential areas are forcing people to flee frontline communities. In recent days, evacuations have continued from the Donetsk region, including a high proportion of children, older people, and those with limited mobility. On arrival in safer areas, many have urgent needs for shelter, medical care, protection, and winter assistance. Our humanitarian partners continue to deliver whenever access allows. Emergency support, including shelter materials, winter assistance, and health services, is being provided in Kiev and other impacted cities and towns. However, humanitarian access remains constrained in some frontline areas due to active hostilities, damaged infrastructure, and security restrictions, delaying or suspending operations where needs are most acute. For civilians in occupied parts of Ukraine, humanitarian organizations have limited information about needs arising from ongoing fighting and winter conditions. The humanitarian community stands ready to support civilians in need wherever they are, including in the occupied areas of Ukraine, where we must have unimpeded humanitarian access and sustained funding. Mr. President, as the escalation of hostilities in Ukraine soon enters its fifth year, 10.8 million people in Ukraine urgently need humanitarian assistance. Tomorrow, that's Tuesday, the 13th of January, the United Nations and our partners, in consultation with the government of Ukraine, will launch the 2026 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, which seeks $2.31 billion to deliver life-saving assistance to 4.12 million people facing the most severe needs. Under the humanitarian reset, the response in Ukraine is sharply focused on those most at risk, particularly along the front line, including civilians affected by displacement and repeated strikes on essential infrastructure. Mr. President, we must reiterate that international humanitarian law is unequivocal. Civilians and civilian objects, wherever they are, must be protected, and constant care must be taken to spare them. Indiscriminate attacks, including those causing disproportionate incidental death or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects, are strictly prohibited. Strikes on residential areas and energy systems raise serious concern about compliance with these fundamental rules of war. I urge members of this Council to act decisively. Use your voice, your influence, and your engagement to ensure these three things. First, that civilians everywhere are protected. Second, that safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need is facilitated. When support is delayed or suspended, the consequences are immediate and severe. Third, that humanitarian action is funded in line with the scale of needs through the hyper-prioritized Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, so that essential life-saving assistance can continue. Mr. President, civilians who are enduring these attacks and need more than statements of concern from this Council. They need that concrete action to reduce civilian harm and ensure that humanitarian support continues to reach people when they need it the most. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Rajasingam for the briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and I thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo and Director Rajasingam for their detailed and factual briefings. Almost 4 years ago, the Russian Federation started its full-scale aggression against Ukraine. This Council has held more than 100 meetings to stop it, but the Russian Federation continues to reject international community's appeals for peace. For this reason, Latvia, together with Liberia, Denmark, France, Greece, and the United Kingdom, supported Ukraine's request for this meeting. Worse, the Russian Federation increases its vile attacks, killing innocent children, mothers, teachers, as well as destroying infrastructure, and continues to endanger diplomatic missions in Kyiv. Once again, the night of 8th to 9th January, the Russian Federation carried out large-scale combined drone and missile attacks on Ukraine. For a second time, it launched an intermediate-range ballistic missile, also capable of carrying nuclear payload. Latvia strongly condemns the continuous barbaric attacks by the Russian Federation, which deliberately target civilians and energy infrastructure in the midst of sub-zero winter. We call on the members of this Council to condemn this systematic brutality, which threatens peace and security globally. The Russian Federation is deliberately testing the limits of international resolve. Latvia will not relent in our support to the core principles of the UN Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Latvia will continue to support Ukraine and will act against the aggressor and its supporters, including through targeted sanctions. The Russian Federation relies on fiction and lies, including the unfounded claims of airstrikes on the residence of the President of the Russian Federation as a pretext. It is deplorable but entirely predictable. A well-worn tactic from the Kremlin's playbook designed to fabricate pretexts, stall for time, deliberately undermine any genuine peace effort. The only verified fact remains that the Russian Federation is killing civilians. And we call on the Russian Federation to stop spreading falsehoods and instead grant access to international monitors, especially UN agencies and the ICRC. And we continue to be deeply concerned by reports about human trafficking from Africa, the Middle East, and other regions to work in drone factories in the Russian Federation and even be sent to the front lines as expendables. Mr. President, Latvia strongly supports the efforts under the leadership of the United States to secure a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Ukraine has clearly demonstrated its readiness to make high sacrifices to achieve it, and the whole of Europe has worked tirelessly in good faith to restore peace in our continent. Last week in Paris, a coalition of over 35 nations, including Latvia, together with Ukraine and the United States, committed to durable principles to achieve peace in Ukraine. The Russian Federation rejects it. It is important to highlight a disturbing pattern. The closer we come to peace and justice, the more brazen the attacks and lies by the Russian Federation become. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reaffirm our resolute support to Ukraine. And let's be clear, for 4 years, the Russian Federation has been deliberately targeting civilians in Ukraine. These inhumane and immoral tactics will not succeed. Ukraine heroically defends itself against aggression. And as an elected member of this Council, Latvia takes its responsibilities with the full weight of the moment, a clear sense of duty under the UN Charter, and is committed to achieving a just and lasting peace. And we urge all members of this Council to uphold their responsibility and recognize the actor obstructing peace and act accordingly. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liberia thanks the briefers for their important updates and thanks the United States and others for efforts aimed at achieving peace. Mr. President, the risks before us are clear. Continued escalation, deepening humanitarian suffering, widespread destruction of infrastructure, and broader regional instability. The war in Ukraine tests not only international peace and security, but the foundational principles of this organization. The principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. These principles are not abstract ideals, nor were they intended to be. They are the rules that make peaceful coexistence among nations possible. Furthermore, they guarantee the maintenance of international peace and security. Whenever the Council has confronted questions on these principles, it has acted to confirm one constant truth. Adherence to these principles is neither optional nor selective. Importantly also, they cannot be upheld in response to convenience. Notably, the erosion of these principles, whether through disregard or selective application, has repeatedly made the world more dangerous and unsafe. This was true 80 years ago. It certainly remains true today. Mr. President, a world committed to multilateralism must reject the notion that force is an effective or legitimate language of security. The very basis of our collective membership in the United Nations is a shared commitment to resolve disputes through dialogue and peaceful means. Therefore, Liberia calls on all parties to respect their obligations under the Charter, obligations to protect civilians, to halt destruction, to take concrete steps toward ending this war, and to prevent further escalation. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Our own lived experience reminds us that military solutions, even when deemed to be possible, do not deliver sustainable peace nor lasting security. Mr. President, Liberia supports this Council's continued engagement on the war in Ukraine. However, we must be clear. When the Council declares itself seized of a matter that gravely threatens international peace and security, it must do so with the collective resolve to move beyond a mere repetition of national positions to a genuine search for a resolution. Anything less risks undermining the credibility of this Council and of the United Nations itself. After years of conflict and repeated warnings of worsening conditions, this Council simply cannot be content with restating positions that have neither advanced peace nor offered hope to those affected. The people of Ukraine and all those impacted by this war deserve peace and they deserve security. That outcome is not impossible. It is, in fact, achievable, but only if we act with seriousness, creativity, urgency, and cooperation. Liberia's own journey from conflict to peace has taught us this hard truth. Peace becomes possible when cooperation replaces confrontation, when dialogue includes even adversaries, and when international law and fidelity to the Charter bind all nations, both big and small. Finally, Mr. President, ours is a simple message. The war must end. The killings must stop. The destruction must cease. The path to true peace must begin. Liberia stands ready to work constructively with all Council members to ensure that future generations inherit a world where peace remains possible. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo and OCHA Director Raja Singham for their briefings. We also welcome the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. Mr. President, while talks to bring peace to Ukraine continue, Russia has again chosen to intensify its brutal war, which brings us again to this Council. It is hard to know which element of Russia's attacks on Ukraine last week, on the night between 8th and 9th of January, is the most outrageous. Firstly, in a single night, Russia fired hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukraine's cities. Before dawn, at least 4 civilians in Kyiv were dead and 25 wounded. And as we've heard from Undersecretary General DiCarlo, paramedics attempting to pull survivors from the rubble were also attacked, a so-called double tap strike, with one of the rescuers also killed. Denmark condemns these shocking Russian attacks. We recall that intentionally directing attacks against civilians is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a war crime. Secondly, Russian missiles struck key sites in Ukraine's energy grid, leaving half of Kyiv's home without heating. This is part of the Kremlin's ongoing efforts to use the harsh winter as a weapon of war and deny Ukraine's civilian population the warmth they need to survive in freezing temperatures. We recall that attacking objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Denmark calls on Russia to immediately comply with all of its HIL obligations. Thirdly, the airstrikes included the deployment of a hypersonic missile which hits the outskirts of Lviv, hitting a city not only a short distance from NATO and EU territory, is a reminder of Russia's recklessness and causes for great concern. Russia's use of this missile has again shown its willingness to escalate its war of aggression. These are irresponsible actions which we condemn and which only reinforce our commitment to continue supporting Ukraine alongside our allies and partners. Mr. President, the Russian aerial blitz on Ukraine is the latest appalling episode in the Kremlin's ongoing and systematic acts of aggression. As we've repeatedly said, it is far beyond high time for Russia's war in Ukraine to stop. Despite intense engagement between Kyiv and Washington, so far we have only seen bad faith participation by Moscow in peace talks. Russia's response to diplomacy has been to inflict more death and destruction to the people of Ukraine. Mr. President, it is clear that the first step must be an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. This is exactly what Ukraine has been offering for almost a year now. In the absence of President Putin showing a sudden and dramatic change of heart, the international community must apply more pressure and do all it can to compel Russia to seriously walk the path to peace. Let me be clear. It was Russia's crime of aggression that was the only root cause of this horrendous war. We cannot turn our backs on the core principles and rules under the UN Charter. The prohibition of the use of force, the right to self-defense, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the peaceful settlement of international disputes. These are key not only to ensuring Ukraine's long-term security, but for all UN member states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长
I thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo
司长的通
and
报。
Director Rajasingham for their
乌克兰危
briefings.
机延宕已接近
The
4年，
Ukraine crisis has dragged
当
on
前
for
乌克兰问
almost
题
4 years.
进入
The
谈判解
situation
决
has now
的
entered
关键阶
a
段。
critical stage of
各重要
negotiated
利益攸关
settlement.
方
The key
相继提
stakeholders
出一
have
些和平
proposed
设想
various
和
peace
方案。
initiatives and plans.
谈判的窗口
The
已经
window
打
for
开，
negotiations has
和平的曙
opened,
光就在前
and the
面。
dawn for peace is
遗憾
within
的是
sight.
地面战事仍在继
Regrettably,
续，
fighting
一
continues
次
on the
次
ground,
给和平曙光
and
蒙上阴影。
repeated flare-ups have
前
cast
进
a
之路
shadow of
依
the
然
prospect of
崎
peace.
岖
The
坎
path
坷。
forward remains arduous.
形势越是复杂严峻，
The more
越不能
complex and
放
grim
弃
the
希望，
situation,
越
the
要
more
加紧努
we
力。
must not give up hope, and the more
第
we
一，
must
要和平，
redouble our
不要
efforts.
战争。
First,
俄乌
peace
是搬不走
must
的邻居，
prevail over war.
实现两国
Russia
和
and
睦相
Ukraine
处
are
是各
inseparable
方
neighbors.
共同期
Achieving
盼。
harmonious
也是
coexistence
唯一
between the two
正确选
countries
择。
is the common aspirations
战争继续延
is the
宕
common
下去，
aspiration of
只
all
会带
parties
来
and
更
the
多
only
无
correct
辜伤
choice.
亡，
Continued
只
war
会加剧
will only
国际
lead
和
to
地
the
区
loss of more
局势
innocent
紧张。
lives and heightened tensions
我们
at the
呼吁有
regional
关各方
and
遵守
international
战
levels.
场不外
We
溢，
call on all
战事
relevant
不升
parties
级，
to abide
各
by
方
the
不
three
拱火
principles
三
of
原
no
则，
expansion of the battlefield,
推
no
动局势
escalation
降
of
温，
fighting, and no
保护
provocation
平
by
民及
any
民用
party
设施，
in order to
为
de-escalate the
政治解决
situation,
危机
protect
积累条
civilians
件，
and civilian
为
infrastructure,
早日实现
create
和平
conditions for political
争取
settlement,
希望。
and strive for the early realization
第二
of，
要
peace.
对话， 不要对抗，
Second, dialogue must
冲突
prevail
再大，
over
矛盾
confrontation.
再深，
Conflicts and
最终
tensions,
都要回到
regardless of their
对话
scale
谈判轨
and
道。
intensity, will
当前
ultimately need to
新一
be
轮和
resolved
谈势
through
头
dialogue
来
and
之不易，
negotiation. The
值得
hard-won
各
momentum
方
of the
珍惜。
latest round of peace talks should be
我们
cherished
呼吁当事
by
方
all
相
sides.
向而行，
We call on the
持
parties
续
to
积
the
累共
conflict
识，
to work towards the
重视
same
并
goal,
妥善解决
continuously build
彼此安全关
consensus,
切，
and take seriously
尽早
and
达成
appropriately
全面、
address each
持久、
other's
有
security
约束力的
concerns
和
in
平
order
协
to
议，
reach a comprehensive,
消
lasting,
除矛盾
and
冲突
binding
的
peace
根源，
agreement as soon as possible. The
构建
potential
均
peace
衡、
deal should
有
eliminate the
效、
root
可
causes
持续的
of
欧
conflict,
洲安全
build a
架构，
balanced, effective,
实现
and
欧洲
sustainable
长治
European
久安。
security architecture, and contribute to the
第
lasting
三，
peace and
要团
stability
结
in the，
不要
continent.
分裂。
Third,
只有团
unity
结更
must
多力量，
prevail over
汇聚
division.
更强呼声，
Garnering more
实
voices
现
and
停
making
火止
stronger
战，
appeals
持久
are
和平，
essential for
才更
promoting a
有希望。
ceasefire and giving lasting
国际
peace
社
a
会
better
要发
chance.
出更多
The
客
international
观、
community
平衡、
should
理性的
project
声音，
a more objective,
帮助早日
balanced,
实现
and
和平愿
rational
景。
voice to help realize
危
the
机影
vision
响
of
持
peace
续外
as
溢，
soon as
已
possible.
对全球经
The
济
continued
造成
spillover of
严
the
重冲
crisis
击。
has severely impinged on
中
the
方
global
反对任
economy.
何一方
China
以危机
opposes
为
the
由
use of the
滥施
crisis
非
by
法
any
单
party
边制
as a
裁，
pretext to impose
打压正
illegal
常经贸
unilateral
往来，
sanctions and
反对借
disrupt
机
normal trade
割
and
裂世
economic
界，
relations.
制造
China
封
also
闭排
opposes
他的
any
各种集
opportunist
团。
attempts to divide the world and create a
主席，
closed
中
and
方在乌
exclusive
克兰问题
blocs.
上的立场非常明确，
China's
一以贯
position on the
之。
question of Ukraine has
我们
been
以习
crystal
近平
clear
主席提出
and
的4
consistent,
个应该
guided by
为
President
根
Xi
本遵
Jinping's
循，
four shoulds.
始终坚持
China has
劝
been
和促谈，
unrelenting
推
in
动危
promoting
机
peace
政治
talks,
解决，
facilitating a
坚
political
持不
settlement,
懈为和
and
平
creating
创造条
conditions
件，
and building
汇聚
consensus
共识。
for peace.
我们一直同俄罗斯、乌
We
克
have
兰等有
maintained
关各方
close
保
communication
持
with
密切
Russia,
沟通，
Ukraine,
积极
and
开展
other
穿
relevant
梭外
parties,
交，
actively
并
engaged
发起
in
成立
shuttle
乌克兰危
diplomacy,
机
and
和
set
平
up
之友小
a
组，
Friends of Peace
不
group
断
for
发
this
出和
purpose.
平呼声，
We have been
凝聚
continuously
和平
making
共
calls
识，
for peace,
推动
garnering
和平
consensus,
努力。
and promoting peace efforts.
中方真诚欢迎
China
一切有
sincerely
利于
welcomes
和
all
平解
efforts
决危机
that
的努力，
contribute to the peaceful
将同
settlement of
其
the
他各
crisis
方一
and
道，
will continue to work with
继续为
others
推动
to
危
play
机
a
政治解
constructive
决
role
发
in
挥建
promoting
设性作用。
a political solution of the crisis.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo and Director Raja Singham for their briefings, and I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in the meeting. Mr. President, the continuing drone and missile attacks unleashed by the Russian Federation against major urban centers, civilians, and critical energy infrastructure in Ukraine, including over the holiday season and the past few days, demonstrate Moscow's disregard for the diplomatic momentum built in Geneva, Florida, and Paris. The intermediate-range ballistic missile strike on January 9 against the Lviv region, just 60 kilometers from the Polish border, using the so-called Oreshnik missile, represents the most recent serious escalation of this war, posing a major threat to the safety and energy security of Ukraine. These recent strikes that resulted in numerous civilian casualties and severe destruction of buildings and critical infrastructure left thousands of Ukrainians without electricity, heating, and water in the middle of winter, illustrating once again utter disregard for international law and international humanitarian law. Moreover, during the strikes in Kiev, the premises of the Embassy of the State of Qatar were damaged in flagrant violation of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. In view of the above, I would like to make 3 points. First, we join the Secretary General in condemning in the strongest possible terms the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian energy infrastructure, in blatant violation of international humanitarian law, and we call upon Russia to cease immediately such unacceptable, unjustifiable, and unlawful acts. As we have heard from USG Di Carlo, 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians in Ukraine since 2022. Total civilian casualties in Ukraine increased by more than 30% compared to the previous year and by 70% compared to 2023. We express our gratitude to all UN and humanitarian agencies in Ukraine, including OCHA, UNICEF, and FAO, for the life-saving services they provide, particularly in protecting the most vulnerable groups such as children, women, and people with disabilities. Second, we reiterate our principled position that the protection of humanitarian personnel should always remain a top priority and that they must never be targeted. We are also deeply concerned by the ongoing impact of hostilities on healthcare infrastructure and personnel. According to the World Health Organization, nearly 43% of all attacks against healthcare facilities globally in 2025 occurred in Ukraine. Tragically, 9 such attacks have already been documented in the country during the first days of 2026. We deplore the fact that during the recent strikes, 1 health worker was killed and several other health workers and rescuers were injured. Third, on peace efforts, Greece welcomes the progress on the draft peace plan achieved in Geneva and Florida, as well as the recent Paris Declaration. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire as necessary first step towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. We remain committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and we unequivocally reject any change of borders as a result of the use of force. This would set a dangerous precedent with potential repercussions on global security. We emphasize that no peace agreement can be sustainable without the direct involvement of Ukraine and Europe and the full consent of Ukraine. And we also stress the need for credible and enforceable security guarantees to prevent the recurrence of war. Last but not least, we should ensure that the post-war period enables for the reconstructions of Ukraine and sets the course for the return not only of peace but also of prosperity to the war-torn country. Mr. President, in closing, Greece reiterates its solidarity with the Ukrainian people as they persevere through the 5th harsh winter of hostilities in Russia's continuing war of aggression against Ukraine. We support the US-led initiatives to end the war, and we call on Russia to engage in the negotiations in good faith, in full conformity with international law and the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Rajasingham for briefing us today, and I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine in our meeting. At the end of last week, Russia launched yet another brutal assault on Ukraine. Ukraine has confirmed that on the night of 8 January, Russia launched 242 drones and 36 missiles, including an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile, against targets across Ukraine, in particular, critical energy infrastructure. As we've heard today, the attack caused the death and injury of dozens of civilians, the deprivation of millions of power and heating at a time when temperatures fell as low as -20 degrees Celsius, and additional pressure on vital services, including healthcare and water supplies. Russia's use of another Oreshnik IRBM should be universally condemned. This hypersonic missile, capable of travelling at over Mach 10, is reported to have hit a site in the region of Lviv, just 50 miles from the Polish border. Such action is reckless. It threatens regional and international security and carries significant risk of escalation and miscalculation. Russia has attempted to justify this escalation by claiming an attack on one of President Putin's residences. But this claim is false. There was no such attack. This is just another case of Russia's use of disinformation to justify egregious and escalatory activity in Ukraine. Russia's latest assault came in the same week that President Zelensky and the US were in Paris with European and international leaders to discuss peace. President Putin claims to want peace, and yet his actions tell a different story. The rest of the world wants peace in Ukraine, a peace in line with the UN Charter. We welcome the significant progress which has been made. Together with our international partners, the UK will continue to work hard towards that goal. President, Russia's attacks are clearly intended to erode the morale of the Ukrainian people. But their resilience and determination over the past 4 years remains undimmed. Energy services are already being restored, damaged homes being rebuilt. Ukraine will survive this latest attack as it survived so many before. And if President Putin thinks this violence will deter Ukraine's partners, he's wrong about that too. We will continue to ensure that Ukraine gets the military and financial support it needs to defend itself. And we will increase pressure on Russia to de-escalate and engage in meaningful negotiations. For the sake of international security and the integrity of the UN Charter, Ukraine must emerge from this war as a sovereign, secure, and independent country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, President, and a special thank you to our two briefers today, and also a special welcome to Ukraine at this meeting. Just days ago, U.S. diplomats met with EU and Ukrainian counterparts to advance negotiations toward a lasting peace. Thanks to the leadership of President Trump, we are closer to a deal now than at any point since the war began. Despite this, Russia launched more attacks on Ukraine, including its launch of its nuclear-capable Orishnik ballistic missile, targeting an area of Ukraine close to the border with Poland and NATO. This constitutes another dangerous and inexplicable escalation of this war, even as the United States is urgently working with Kyiv, other partners, and Moscow to end the war through a negotiated settlement. At a moment of tremendous potential, due only to President Trump's unparalleled commitment to peace around the world, both sides should be seeking ways to de-escalate. Yet Russia's action risks expanding and intensifying the war. From the start, President Trump has decried the carnage of this conflict. Horribly, we have to continue to deplore the staggering number of casualties, service members and civilians, men, women, and children. We condemn Russia's continuing and intensifying attacks on Ukraine's energy facilities and other civilian infrastructure. These attacks make a mockery of the cause of peace, a cause of paramount importance to the world and to President Trump. I would like to remind the Russian Federation of its vote in favor of Security Council Resolution 2774 nearly 1 year ago. That resolution called for a swift end to the conflict and lasting peace. It would be nice if Russia matched their words with deeds. In the spirit of that resolution, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe must pursue peace seriously and bring this nightmare to an end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Monsieur le Président,
President,
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les
Excellencies,
membres du Conseil,
distinguished council members,
La République démocratique
The
du Congo
Democratic
s'exprime pour
Republic
la
of the
toute première
Congo
fois
is taking
dans
the
sa
floor
capacité nationale
for the
depuis
very
son
first time
accession
in its national
au Conseil de
capacity
sécurité
ever since we became a
et
member of the Security
souhaite avant
Council.
toute chose adresser ses
At
chaleureuses
the outset,
félicitations
we would like to extend
à
our
la
heartfelt
République de
congratulations
Somalie
to the Republic of
qui
Somalia,
assure la présidence du Conseil
which
en
is
ce premier
presiding
mois de l'année.
over the Security Council
Mon pays
in the
félicite
month of
également
January. My
le
country
Bahreïn,
would
la
also like to
Colombie,
congratulate
la
Bahrain,
Lettonie
Colombia,
et le
Latvia,
Libéria pour leur
and
entrée au Conseil
Liberia on their
et
accession
salue
to the
les
Security Council.
interventions de
We welcome
Madame la sous-secrétaire générale des Nations
the
Unies aux affaires
interventions by
politiques et à la
USG for Political
consolidation de
and
la
Peace
paix,
Building
ainsi que
Affairs,
celle du directeur de la
as well as
division
that
de la
of
coordination
the
de l'OCHA,
OCHA
dont les
Director.
exposés ont permis au Conseil de disposer
Your briefings
d'un
gave the
aperçu
Council
actualisé
an
sur
updated
l'évolution de la
snapshot
situation en
of
Ukraine.
developments in Ukraine.
La République démocratique
The
du
Democratic
Congo
Republic of
salue
the Congo
enfin la
would
présence
also like
du
to welcome
représentant
the
permanent de
presence of the
l'Ukraine à
permanent
cette
representative of Ukraine at this
Monsieur le
meeting.
Président,
President,
la République
the
démocratique du
Democratic
Congo demeure
Republic of the
profondément
Congo remains
préoccupée
deeply
par la
disquieted
détérioration
by the
continue de la
ongoing
situation
deterioration
sécuritaire et
of the
humanitaire en
security and
Ukraine.
humanitarian situation in Ukraine.
La prolongation de ce conflit ne fait
The
qu'aggraver les
continuation of
souffrances
this
des populations
conflict does
civiles
nothing but
et compromet
exacerbate
chaque
the
jour
suffering of
davantage
civilians,
les
and with
perspectives d'une
each
paix durable.
passing day
À cet égard,
dims the prospects for
l'escalade
lasting
observée au
peace.
cours de la semaine écoulée
The
rappelle
escalation we've
avec
seen over the last
acuité
week
l'urgence
is a sharp
maintes fois
reminder
soulignée
of
au
the
sein de ce
pressing
Conseil
need,
de
which has been
privilégier une
highlighted by this
solution
Council countless
du
times,
conflit
the
par
pressing need
une
to
résolution
opt
du conflit par des
for
voies pacifiques,
conflict resolution
notamment par la
via
diplomatie
peaceful means,
et le
in
dialogue,
particular
conformément
diplomacy
aux principes
and
du droit
dialogue,
international,
in accordance with the
du droit
principles of
international
international law,
humanitaire
international
et aux
humanitarian law,
dispositions pertinentes de la
and
Charte des
relevant
Nations Unies.
provisions of the United Nations
Mon pays
Charter.
appelle à ce titre
Thus, my
toutes les
country
parties à respecter
calls on all
scrupuleusement
parties to
les obligations
meticulously
qui leur incombent
uphold
en vertu
the
du droit
obligations incumbent
international
upon them
et
under
rappelle que les
international
populations
law.
civiles,
We
de
record
même
that
que
civilians,
les
much
infrastructures
like
civiles essentielles
essential and
et
critical
critiques
civilian
doivent
infrastructure,
être protégées et
must be
préservées en toutes
protected and
circonstances.
safeguarded under all
La République
circumstances.
démocratique du
The
Congo
Democratic
exhorte
Republic of
par
the Congo
ailleurs les parties à
also
garantir
urges
un
the
accès
parties
humanitaire
to
sûr,
guarantee
rapide
safe,
et sans
rapid
entrave
and
afin de
unimpeded humanitarian
permettre aux
access
acteurs
so as to
humanitaires
allow humanitarian
d'apporter une
actors to
assistance
deliver
efficace aux
effective
populations
assistance
civiles durement
to
affectées
civilians
par ce
hard
conflit.
hit
Monsieur
by
le
this
Président,
conflict.
la République
President,
démocratique du Congo demeure
The Democratic
convaincue
Republic of the Congo stands
qu'il ne
convinced
saurait y
that
avoir
there
de solution
cannot
militaire
be
durable
a
à ce
lasting
conflit
military
prolongé,
solution to this
lequel
protracted
se
conflict.
trouve aujourd'hui
A conflict
dans une
which
impasse
today
manifeste dont le
is
principal
at
corollaire
a clear
demeure le
impasse,
lourd tribut payé
of which the
jour après
principal
jour par les
corollary
populations civiles.
is the heavy price paid
Dans cette
day in, day
perspective,
out by
mon
civilians.
pays salue les
From this
efforts
vantage
diplomatiques
point, my country would like to
et de
welcome
médiation
the
déployés
diplomatic
par
and
les
mediation
partenaires
efforts
internationaux,
deployed by
notamment
international partners.
les rencontres initiées
In particular,
au mois de décembre
the
par les
meetings
États-Unis qui
initiated
visent
in
à
December by the
favoriser le
United
dialogue
States,
ainsi que
aiming at
la création des
promoting
conditions
dialogue
d'une désescalade
as well as
progressive des
creating
tensions.
the conditions
La
for a
paix,
progressive
la sécurité ainsi que la
de-escalation of
dignité des
tensions.
populations
Peace,
prises au
security,
piège
and the
par ces
dignity
conflits
of
constituent une priorité
people
pour la
taken
République
hostage by this
démocratique du
conflict
Congo.
are a priority for the
C'est
Democratic Republic
pourquoi
of
nous
Congo.
réaffirmons
For this reason,
notre
we reiterate
disponibilité
our
à
readiness
soutenir
to
toute
support
initiative
all
crédible visant
credible
une
initiatives
résolution
aimed
pacifique du
at
conflit en Ukraine,
ensuring a
de
peaceful settlement
nature
of the
à
conflict in
réduire
Ukraine
les souffrances
so as to
humaines
reduce
et à
human
prévenir
suffering
toute
and
extension
prevent
ou régionalisation de la crise.
regionalization
encourageons en ce
or
sens
extension of the crisis.
l'ensemble des parties
Therefore,
à
we
faire
encourage
preuve de
all
retenue
parties to
et à
exercise
œuvrer en
restraint
faveur d'une
and to strive
désescalade
towards
afin de créer un climat
de-escalation
propice
so as to
d'une
create
part à la
conditions which are
reprise
conducive
et d'autre part à la
both to a
poursuite d'échanges
resumption
diplomatiques
and
et
a
de
continuation
négociations
of diplomatic
constructives
exchanges and
permettant
constructive
de s'attaquer aux
negotiations
causes profondes
so as to be able
du
to
conflit.
tackle the root causes
Cela
of this
dans le
conflict.
plein
And
respect du
this
droit international
with full
et de la
respect
Charte
for
des
international
Nations
law
Unies.
and the United
Pour
Nations
conclure,
Charter.
la
By way of
République
conclusion,
démocratique
the
du Congo
Democratic
réaffirme
Republic of the Congo
son soutien à tous les
reiterates
efforts
its support
diplomatiques
for all
visant à
diplomatic
parvenir
efforts
à une
aimed at
solution
crafting
négociée
a negotiated
qui
solution
rétablisse durablement la
which
paix,
would
la sécurité
sustainably
et la
reestablish
stabilité
peace,
au
security, and
bénéfice des
stability
populations
for the benefit
concernées
of
et
people
de l'ensemble de
in
la
Ukraine and throughout the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank the USG DiCarlo, USG for Humanitarian, for Political Affairs and Peace Building. I would also like to thank Director Raja Singham from OCHA for their insightful briefings on the topic of our session today. The Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its regret for the continuation of this war for the fourth year. Military operations still continue while civilians still shoulder the biggest burden of this war, and civilian infrastructure is damaged, which undermines the possibility to provide basic and essential services while humanitarian needs rise. We reiterate the importance of avoiding any acts that could adversely affect infrastructure and civilian facilities, embassies, diplomatic missions, and headquarters of international organizations, civil organizations based on international customs and norms. We regret the damage that was made to the Embassy of Qatar in Kyiv. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain is firmly convinced that ending the war in Ukraine lies in continuing dialogue and negotiations and to hold on firmly to the principles of international law and international humanitarian law and the Charter of United Nations, and that all conflicts must be resolved peacefully in order to reach political resolution for them. We reiterate that it is necessary to keep dialogue and communication channels open and to work on coordination and consultation between all concerned parties to promote trust and to limit hostilities and their worsening in order to work on efforts towards peace. We also call for doubling efforts to have a negotiations path that would deal with the root causes of the conflict and would work on the security concerns of all parties in order to ensure the sustainability of this solution. We appreciate the diplomatic efforts of the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the State of Qatar, which included efforts for mediation and humanitarian response, including exchange of prisoners and providing relief assistance and the exchange of detainees in order to alleviate humanitarian suffering and to prevent the expansion of this war. We reiterate the importance of reaching a positive development in the negotiations led by President Donald Trump, as this is an essential diplomatic initiative to reach a permanent ceasefire and achieve stability in Europe. In conclusion, we reiterate our support for regional and international efforts aimed at finding a comprehensive and lasting solution for the crisis in line with the principles of international law and the Charter of United Nations and UN Resolution 2774 in a way that would promote security and stability and peace regionally and internationally. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradecemos la
We
participación
would like
de la
to
señora Rosemary
thank
DiCarlo,
Madam Rosemary DiCarlo,
Secretaria General Adjunta de
Undersecretary
Asuntos
General for
Políticos
Political
y de
and
Consolidación
Peacebuilding
de la Paz,
Affairs,
y al señor
and
Ramesh
Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham,
representante de la Oficina de Coordinación de
representative
Asuntos
of the Office
Humanitarios,
for the Coordination
quienes han
of
aportado
Humanitarian
información
Affairs. We
valiosa
thank them
sobre la
both for the
situación en el
valuable
terreno.
information provided
Tomamos
with
nota de la
regard to the
participación de los
situation on the ground.
representantes
We also take
de
note
las
of the
delegaciones
participation of
europeas
the
en esta
European
reunión de
delegations in this emergency meeting.
entre Rusia y
The
Ucrania
conflict between
es una
the Russian
guerra
Federation and Ukraine
está a punto
is
de
a
cumplir
war that is
4
now
años
approaching its
y
4th
sin
year
que se presenten indicios de
without
una posible
there being
terminación.
any possible
Ucrania,
end
de
in
acuerdo
sight.
con datos verificados por el
According
Sistema de
to
Naciones
figures
Unidas,
verified by the United
al menos
Nations system, in Ukraine, at
14.533
least
civiles han perdido
14,533
la vida
civilians
desde el
have
inicio
been
del
killed
conflicto.
since the start of
En
the
el
conflict
territorio de
in
la
Ukraine.
Federación de Rusia,
And according to
según cifras
figures
reportadas por
reported
sus
by the
autoridades,
authorities of the Russian Federation,
7.269 civiles habrían
7,269
perdido la vida
civilians are
durante el
reported to
mismo
have lost their
periodo.
lives during the same
Estas
period.
cifras no reflejan, sin embargo,
These figures,
las
however,
altísimas cifras
do not
de víctimas
reflect the
militares de
high
ambas partes.
level of military
En
victims
conjunto,
on both sides.
estas cifras
Together,
sí describen
these figures
una tragedia
do
humana
describe
profundamente alarmante, que
profoundly
sigue
alarming
siendo motivo de
human
grave
tragedy
preocupación
that
para la comunidad
continues to be
internacional,
of great
al
concern to the
haberse
international
convertido en una
community.
espiral
It has
lamentablemente
become a
interminable
spiral,
de
an endless
violencia, de
spiral
luto
of
y de dolor.
violence,
Desde que
of
comenzó este
suffering.
conflicto, y
Since the
repito, hace casi
conflict began
4 años,
almost 4 years
el Consejo
ago,
de Seguridad
the
se ha
Security
reunido
Council
en
has
múltiples
met
ocasiones,
multiple times,
incluyendo en 76
including
reuniones formales
76
para
formal
abordar el
meetings
tema,
to address the situation.
sin que, por causa de la ausencia total de voluntad política
And
de las
still,
partes,
in the absence
haya
of
sido
sufficient
posible
political
alcanzar
will,
una solución
it
duradera
has not been
que
possible
evite
to
la continuación del sufrimiento
put an
humano.
end to this human
Hoy,
suffering.
este Consejo ha
Today,
sido
this
convocado
council
una
has
vez
been
más
convened
para
once
examinar
again
el mismo
to
asunto.
examine the same
Y es
matter.
que en el contexto de la reciente serie
And
de
in the
contraataques en Ucrania,
context of the
se ha
recent
observado el
counterattacks in
uso no
Ukraine,
solo de
we've
drones
seen the
y
use not
misiles
only of
balísticos,
drones and
sino también
hypersonic
en esta
missiles,
ocasión
but also
de
this
un
time
misil hipersónico
a
de alta velocidad y
high-speed,
capacidad.
high-capacity
Este ataque
hypersonic
no
missile.
solo ha provocado la
These
muerte
attacks
de
have
más
not
civiles y
only
daños
led to the deaths of more
significativos a
civilian
infraestructura
lives
civil
and
esencial,
caused serious
sino que
damage to
además,
critical
de manera
civilian
inexcusable,
infrastructure, but
ha alcanzado la sede
unexcusably,
diplomática del
they
Estado
have
de
also
Qatar,
affected,
produciendo daños a
struck
la
the
misma.
diplomatic headquarters of the state of
Panamá
Qatar, resulting in
hace
damage.
otra vez
Panama,
un llamado
once again,
urgente a la contención,
urgently
al
calls
respeto de la
for
población
restraint,
civil y a
for
la búsqueda
respect
de
of
una
the
solución
civilian
pacífica
population and the
conforme a la
search for
Carta de
a
las
peaceful
Naciones Unidas.
solution in accordance with the
En esa
United
misma
Nations
línea,
Charter.
observamos con
In this
atención
regard, we
los esfuerzos
are closely
diplomáticos
following
sugeridos
the
muy
diplomatic
recientemente por
efforts
Italia
led very
y
recently
Francia,
by Italy
así
and
como,
France,
sobre todo,
as well
los importantes
and
gestiones
above
que ha
all, the
adelantado
important
Estados
steps
Unidos,
taken by the United
orientados
States.
todos a facilitar
All of these
un
efforts
mayor
aimed
acercamiento entre las
at
partes
bringing
con miras
the
a lograr
parties closer
acuerdos
together
para una
in order
solución
to
política
achieve
que tenga
agreements for a
plenamente en
political
cuenta
solution that will
el
fully
respeto a los
take into
principios
account
de la Carta de
respect
las
for the
Naciones
principles
Unidas
of the
y el
UN
derecho
Charter
internacional.
and international law.
Estos esfuerzos
These
parecieran
efforts
encender una luz de
perhaps
esperanza
offer us a glimmer
que,
of
aunque
hope,
tenue,
even
ojalá
though
alumbre el
it's
camino
fragile,
hacia el fin de las
but they may
hostilidades
point the
y a la
path toward
protección de la
a
población
cessation of
civil,
hostilities and the
permitiendo
protection of
lograr un
civilians,
acuerdo y sentar
making
las
it
bases
possible to
para una paz
achieve a
justa
solution,
y
laying the
duradera.
foundations
Muchas
for a
gracias.
just and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr.
Por
President.
convocar esta sesión de
Thank you
emergencia
for convening
y
this
extiendo también mi
emergency session,
agradecimiento a la
and I also would
subsecretaria
like to
general
extend my thanks
para
to
Asuntos
the
Políticos y de
Undersecretary General for
Consolidación de
Political
Paz
and
de las
Peacebuilding
Naciones Unidas,
Affairs of the United
así como al
Nations,
director y
as well as to
representante
the
de la Oficina
Director
de
and Representative
Coordinación
of
de
the United
Asuntos
Nations Office
Humanitarios
for
de
the
las Naciones Unidas
Coordination of
por
Humanitarian
sus completos
Affairs. I
reportes
thank
que
them both
revelan
for
una
their
vez
comprehensive
más
reports,
la gravedad de
which
la
once again
situación
reveal
humanitaria
the
en
severity of the
Ucrania, con
humanitarian
un saldo
situation in
humano
Ukraine,
cada vez
with an
más
increasingly
devastador.
devastating human toll.
Colombia manifiesta su
Colombia
absoluto rechazo al
expresses
uso
its
de la
absolute
fuerza y a
rejection
las
of the use of
amenazas de
force
uso de la
and of
fuerza,
threats of the use
pues
of
son
force,
acciones que
as these
atentan
are
contra la
actions
integridad
that undermine
territorial
the
y la
territorial
independencia
integrity
política de
and
cualquier
political
país.
independence of any
Estos
country.
hechos constituyen
These
una
acts
violación
constitute
directa
a
de los
direct violation of
propósitos y
the fundamental
principios
purposes and
fundamentales
principles
de la Carta
of
de las
the
Naciones
Charter
Unidas
of the United
y del derecho
Nations,
internacional.
as well as violations of international law. Likewise, Colombia deeply regrets the reports provided by various humanitarian agencies referring to grave impacts on the civilian population, including fatalities. In this regard, my country expresses its solidarity with civilian victims, including humanitarian personnel and their families. We're also concerned by the damage to and attacks on critical infrastructure for the civilian population. These incidents must be strongly condemned and must cease immediately. Colombia will always reject any activity that endangers civilians and humanitarian staff, including medical personnel who work tirelessly and risk their lives to provide relief to affected persons. Respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances and without exception is an obligation of the parties, and it is not a negotiable matter. Mr. President, Colombia also reiterates its concern regarding the impact of hostilities on women, children, older persons, and entire families who are surviving under the extreme conditions of winter. This underscores the urgency of ensuring safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access, as well as respect for infrastructure and critical goods that are necessary to sustain the civilian population. It is urgent to adopt concrete measures that lead to de-escalation and to keeping channels of dialogue open and functional between the parties in order to advance towards a negotiated, peaceful, and comprehensive solution that guarantees a just, sustainable, and lasting peace. Mr. President, Excellencies, this Council cannot remain indifferent to the daily loss of human lives. Colombia urges the parties to refrain from intensifying hostilities, as they only hinder ongoing diplomatic efforts, erode the minimum trust needed to make progress on agreements, and reduce the prospects for a peaceful solution. In conclusion, the protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law and the establishment of an immediate and complete ceasefire continue to remain priorities. For this reason, and being mindful of the challenges involved in the pursuit of peace, Colombia calls upon the parties to choose a negotiated solution with goodwill and good faith, prioritizing dialogue and the principles of the United Nations Charter. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie tout
Thank
d'abord
you,
la
Mr. President. I'd
Secrétaire
like to
générale
begin by
adjointe,
thanking
Madame
Under-Secretary General Madame
ainsi que
Rosemary
le
DiCarlo,
directeur du
as well as the
BCH à Genève,
Director of
Monsieur
OCHA in
Ramesh
Geneva, Mr.
Rajasingham, pour leurs
Ramesh
interventions.
Rajasingham, for their briefings.
La situation
The
qu'il décrit ne
situation
souffre pas d'ambiguïté.
is
D'un
unambiguous,
côté,
that is
l'Ukraine,
described. On the one hand,
agressée par la Russie,
Ukraine, which has been attacked by Russia,
et l'Ukraine ne cesse de démontrer sa volonté de paix,
continues to
et ce, dans le
demonstrate its
cadre des
willingness
efforts pour
for
mettre fin à la
peace,
guerre
to put
menés
an
par
end
les
to the
États-Unis
war,
et l'Europe.
particularly within the framework of the efforts led by the
L'Ukraine
United
l'a fait
States and Europe.
systématiquement au cours des
It has
rencontres de
done
haut
this
niveau qui
systematically
se sont
during the
déroulées aux
high-level
États-Unis et en
meetings held in
Europe
the United
au cours des
States
dernières semaines.
and in Europe over the past weeks.
De l'autre côté, la Russie,
On the other hand,
qui
Russia
fait une fois de plus le choix de
is
l'escalade de la
once again
violence
choosing to
et du
escalate the
ciblage des
violence and
populations civiles
target the
ukrainiennes.
Ukrainian civilian
Nous
population.
renouvelons notre profonde solidarité
And we once again
avec
express
le
our
peuple
full
ukrainien.
solidarity with the Ukrainian people.
Monsieur le Président, il y
Mr.
a quelques
President,
jours, le
a few
ministre russe
days
des
ago,
Affaires
Russian
étrangères, Sergei
Foreign
Lavrov,
Minister Sergei
n'avait pas
Lavrov
hésité à
did not
indiquer que
hesitate
les
to
Européens, et je le
state that,
cite,
and I quote,
constituaient le principal
Europeans
obstacle à la paix.
constituted the main obstacle to peace.
Mais quand la Russie se
But
targue
when
de
Russia
tirer
boasts
un
of
missile
firing
balistique
a
à
nuclear
capacité
capable
d'emport
ballistic
nucléaire
missile
sur Lviv,
at Lviv,
à 50 km de la
50
frontière
kilometers from the
polonaise,
Polish border,
quel État
which
constitue
state
réellement
truly
un obstacle à la paix?
constitutes an obstacle to peace?
D'autant que la Russie a affirmé le
Especially
faire
since
en
Russia
réponse à une
claimed
prétendue
to
attaque
be acting in
ukrainienne
response to
sur
an
une
alleged
résidence
Ukrainian
présidentielle
attack
russe,
on a Russian presidential
prétendue
residence,
attaque dont nous savons tous
an alleged attack that we all know
qu'elle est une grossière mise en scène
is a
russe
crude
pour
Russian
saper le processus de
staging
paix
aimed at
au moment où
undermining
il s'agit
the
pour elle, la
peace
Russie,
process
de
at a
répondre à
time
une
when it's up
proposition
to Russia
patiemment
to
élaborée
respond to
par les
a
médiateurs
carefully
américains.
prepared proposal by the American mediators.
Quand la Russie bombarde sciemment
When
le réseau
Russia
d'électricité,
deliberately
de
bombs
chauffage
the
et d'eau
electricity,
courante
heating
des
and
grandes
running
villes
water
ukrainiennes
networks of
au mépris des
major
conventions de
Ukrainian
Genève,
cities in
quel
disregard
État
of the
constitue
Geneva Conventions,
réellement un
which
obstacle à la
state
paix?
truly
Ces frappes
constitutes an obstacle
provoquent
to
une
peace?
situation
These
humanitaire
strikes
dramatique
are causing a
pour des
dramatic
centaines de milliers de
humanitarian
civils
situation for
confrontés
hundreds
à des
of thousands of
températures
civilians facing freezing temperatures.
Quand les frappes touchent l'ambassade du
When
Qatar en
strikes hit the
Ukraine,
embassy of Qatar in
au mépris de la
Ukraine
Convention de
in
Vienne,
violation of the
et
Vienna
quand les drones
Convention,
russes
and when
attaquent les
Russian
navires
drones attack
céréaliers à
grain
Odessa,
vessels in
mettant en
Odessa,
péril la sécurité
jeopardizing
alimentaire
global
mondiale,
food security,
quel État
which
constitue
state
réellement
truly
un obstacle à la
constitutes
paix?
an obstacle to peace?
C'est la Russie qui, il y a
It
presque
is
4 ans,
Russia which
a
almost
lancé une
4
guerre
years
d'agression
ago
contre un État
launched a war
souverain
of aggression
en
against a
violation de
sovereign
la Charte
state
des Nations
in
Unies.
violation of the United
C'est la
Nations
Russie
Charter.
qui, tous les jours,
It is
choisit de poursuivre
Russia
cette
which
agression,
every day
alors
chooses
qu'elle
to
pourrait
continue
l'arrêter à
this
tout
aggression,
moment,
even though
sans
it could stop it
préjudice pour
at
sa propre
any moment
sécurité.
without harming its own
Les tentatives
security.
de la Russie pour inverser cette
Russia's
réalité
grotesque
ne
attempts to
sauraient
reverse this
tromper ce
reality
Conseil,
cannot deceive the
pas
members
plus
of
que
this
la
Council,
communauté
nor the
internationale.
entire international community.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
avec ses partenaires européens,
together with its European
la France
partners,
continuera dans la
France will
durée à
continue
soutenir
over
l'Ukraine
the long term
dans
to support
l'exercice
Ukraine
de son
in
droit à la
exercising its
légitime
right to
défense
legitimate
face à l'agression
self-defense
dont elle fait
in the face
l'objet
of the
et à
aggression
soutenir
it
sa
is suffering,
souveraineté,
and to
son
support
indépendance
its
et son
sovereignty,
intégrité
independence, and territorial
Les
integrity.
décisions prises lors du
The
Conseil
robust
européen du 18
decisions taken
décembre
at
en
the European
témoignent
Council on the
pour
18th
qui
of December bear
pourrait
witness
douter
to this,
de notre
for anyone
détermination.
who might doubt our determination.
Nous préparons aussi
We're also
les modalités d'une
preparing
paix
the
juste
terms of
et
a
durable.
just and lasting peace.
Ce fut tout l'objet du
This was
sommet de Paris du
precisely
6
the
janvier
purpose of
dernier,
the Paris Summit
qui a
of the
rassemblé
6th of
35
January,
États
which
membres de
brought
la
together
coalition des
35 member
volontaires,
states of the coalition
l'Ukraine et
of the
les
willing,
États-Unis,
Ukraine and the
afin de
United
nous engager
States,
tous
in order
en
to
faveur d'un
commit
système de
ourselves
garantie
to
de
a system
sécurité
of
collective
security
pour l'Ukraine,
guarantees for
aussitôt qu'un
Ukraine
cessez-le-feu
as soon as a
entrera en
ceasefire
vigueur.
enters into force.
Tout règlement devra en
Any
effet être
settlement
soutenu
must indeed
par des
be
garanties de
supported by
sécurité
solid
solides pour
security
l'Ukraine
guarantees for
afin
Ukraine
d'empêcher
in order
toute
to
nouvelle
prevent
agression.
any new Russian
Monsieur le
aggression.
Président, avec le secrétaire
Mr.
général des
President,
Nations
together
Unies,
with the Secretary
avec la
General
grande
of the
majorité de
United
la
Nations,
communauté
with the
internationale
vast
et avec
majority of the
l'Ukraine,
international
la
community and
France
with Ukraine,
réitère sa demande d'un
France
cessez-le-feu
reiterates its
complet,
call for a
immédiat
complete,
et
immediate, and
inconditionnel,
unconditional
alors que la guerre
ceasefire,
d'agression
as
russe
the
dure
Russian war
depuis
of
près de
aggression
4
has
ans.
now lasted almost
Nous appelons la
4
Russie à
years.
écouter ces voix
We call upon
venues de
Russia to
l'ensemble du
listen to
globe,
these voices from
à cesser
across
son
the globe,
agression
to cease
et à
its aggression,
préférer un
and to
véritable
choose
dialogue
genuine
aux
dialogue
manœuvres
over
dilatoires.
delaying tactics.
La France continuera
France will
d'œuvrer sans
continue
relâche
to work
aux côtés de
tirelessly
l'ensemble de ses
alongside
partenaires
all its
en faveur d'une
partners
paix
in
juste et
favor of a
durable.
just
Je vous remercie.
and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
President, I would like to join colleagues in thanking Under-Secretary General DiCarlo and Mr. Rajasingham for their briefings. Next month will mark 4 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The international community has been deeply perturbed by the continuing relentless hostilities, leaving behind a trail of death, destruction, economic losses, and immense humanitarian suffering, as we have also heard in today's briefings. We are alarmed by the recent intensification in fighting, with escalation in attacks from both sides, further worsening the already dire humanitarian situation. And such actions not only perpetuate the conflict, they undermine trust and the ongoing efforts for peace. Protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental obligation and the foundation of the principles of international humanitarian law, which must be upheld fully by all sides. The reported damage to the Embassy of Qatar in Kiev is regrettable. Protection of diplomatic missions and the safety of its personnel is an obligation under international law. President, from the outset, Pakistan's position has been anchored in an unwavering conviction, the supremacy of dialogue, as the only viable path for lasting peace. Now, more than ever before, the overwhelming global opinion is on the side of ending this conflict through peaceful means. This can only be achieved through a sustained, meaningful, and structured dialogue. Diplomacy and genuine engagement we have seen have delivered in the past. In the case of Black Sea Grain Initiative in July of 2022, and earlier in Istanbul, the two sides were seemingly very close to an agreement within weeks of the start of the conflict. The Security Council Resolution 2774 of last February was another opportunity that should have been seized in earnest by all sides for a swift end to the conflict. And Resolution 2788, adopted in July, further reinforced the imperative of peaceful settlement of disputes. Fortunately, the window for peace is still there. We commend efforts by many countries, particularly the United States, for the resolution of this conflict, giving primacy to dialogue. We hope that all sides will make full use of the ongoing diplomacy, demonstrate genuine political will, and engage constructively to make meaningful strides towards a peaceful, negotiated settlement of the conflict, starting with an immediate ceasefire. We hope that these efforts would lead to a just and lasting settlement in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements acceptable to all sides, that corresponds to the security interests of both Ukraine and Russia and ensures peace and stability in Europe. The imperative to deliver millions from agony must remain paramount. For this, the path forward should be guided by sagacity, mutual understanding, and collective concern for humanity. Pakistan supports all efforts aimed at resolving the issue peacefully in a comprehensive and durable manner. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we're under the impression that some of the elected members came here to the Council with just one priority: to be the mouthpiece for the Party of War's line, to accuse Russia of all ills, completely ignoring the causal links which are the reason for the particularly deep crisis of European security. They believe that they're blameless. Our supercilious ex-partners never noticed, nor do they now see, the plank in their own eye. They are suffering from political colorblindness. They see everything as being black or white. The Russian army conducted one massive and four grouped strikes between the 3rd and 9th of January. As a result, we struck transport, air, port, and energy infrastructure, which sustain the work of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, as well as Ukrainian armed forces, UAF temporary deployment sites, and those of foreign mercenaries. This was in response to an attack waged by the Kiev regime on the residency of the Russian president and civilian infrastructure objects in Russia. During the strike, the Oreshnik system was used, a system against which there is no air defense. Our Western colleagues tell us about civilian casualties, the majority of which, as everyone knows, including the Ukrainians, which are the consequences of the work of Ukrainian air defenses. All of these loud but utterly groundless assertions about targeted Russian attacks on Ukrainian families soundly asleep in their homes are utterly uncorroborated. They're not backed up by any facts nor any evidence. The Russian armed forces do not strike civilians. At the same time, our Western colleagues are completely ignoring the crimes being committed by the Kiev regime, which is deliberately striking at Russian regions, striking at civilian objects and civilians. In December 2025 alone, the number of civilians injured by UAF strikes, these are civilians, the figure stood at least 367 people. 56 people died. Against this backdrop, we are to this day astounded by the silent response on the part of the international community, first and foremost the Secretary General of the UN. It's now the norm. Avoiding clearly qualifying such actions as terrorist acts, writing these off as uncorroborated facts is tantamount to jettisoning the basic principles of international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians and a ban on premeditated strikes on civilian objects. Yet as soon as Russia uses its military against the Ukrainian armed forces and its infrastructure, emotions start to run high. There are equivocal comments made by the SG and his press secretary. This selective blindness, unfortunately, is characteristic of the UN Secretariat's leadership. In the absence of a response from the so-called collective West, much like the fact that leading Western media sources are completely ignoring these tragedies, is now the lamentable norm. This equates to, de facto, covering for the terrorist acts committed by the Kiev regime and complicity therein. After all, responsibility for what's happening falls not only on those who are pulling the trigger, but also on those who for years have been promoting impunity, supplying arms, and providing political cover for such actions. That's what the billions Ukraine has pested out of the pockets of European taxpayers is going towards. This complicity, this aiding and abetting, sooner or later you'll have to take responsibility for this. We've repeatedly said that not a single action taken by the neo-Nazi posse which has hunkered down in Kiev will go unanswered. An utterly flagrant case is yet another despicable terrorist act committed against civilians in the village of Holy, a resort in the Kherson region. Civilians, families with children, locals and visitors gathered at a hotel cafe to celebrate the new year, 2026. At that very moment, Ukrainian terrorists conducted a premeditated strike on this gathering. As a result of the terrorist attack, 29 people perished, including 2 children. Over 30 people were wounded. We don't have the slightest doubt about this odious attack being planned in advance. It was premeditated. Before the strike, a reconnaissance UAV loitered over this settlement for a long time. This serves as further confirmation about the fact that Ukrainians knew full well where it was striking and at whom it was striking. The attack was conducted as clocks struck midnight, right when there were civilians in the building. For those who don't know this, the village of Holy is located in a resort zone on the Gorky Kut Peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by the Black Sea. It lies beyond the so-called Red Line. There are no, nor have there ever been any military objects there. The former port long ago lost any significance, and the area is being developed solely for leisure purposes. There are children's camps, recreation centers, and other tourist infrastructure there. Now, this vile terrorist act stands out for its cynicism. While the media, controlled by the office of the Ukrainian president, broadcast the Kiev president's New Year's address, the address by the overseer head of the Kiev regime, containing fallacious calls for peace, the UAF fighters at that very moment deliberately annihilated civilians. Colleagues, we're no longer surprised by the narratives we hear in this chamber. Narratives from those who use their beloved double standards to request Security Council meetings on Ukraine and at the same time hypocritically turned a blind eye to ruthless killings committed on the orders of the Zelensky regime, mired in terrorism, corruption, and lawlessness. Zelensky, who's determined to get as much money and weapons from its European puppeteers, both for himself and his inner circle. This terrorist act is not an exception. It's one of the many examples of inhumane crimes committed by the Zelensky regime against Russian civilians. Ms. DiCarlo mentioned them, at least. But as always, the UN cannot verify these. 500,000 people in the Belgorod region are without electricity, but the UN can't verify that for some reason. The Ukrainian posse won't be helped neither by the failed French summit of the coalition of the willing, nor by the advance towards Ukrainian borders of NATO forces. The consequences of NATO's presence in the Ukraine is something we've spoken about repeatedly. Although this is something many boasted about only recently, the threat of this was to a large extent the trigger for us starting a special military operation, alongside our desire to end the war waged by the Kiev regime against its own people. Nor will they be helped by incantations about a ceasefire in hope of getting a breather from the devastating defeats Ukraine is experiencing on the battlefield. Nor will Zelensky be helped by his absurd conditions, which don't factor in reality links to which he lost long ago. These are conditions he sets in response to US proposals, thereby nullifying them. All of a sudden, the European Commission is discussing the fact that at some stage, the EU will have to engage in dialogue with Russia. It makes us want to ask, where have you been all this time? We have never turned away from dialogue. It is you who superciliously thought that it won't get that far. It won't go as far as talks because strategic defeat would be inflicted on the Russian Federation. Until the leader in Kiev comes to his senses and agrees to realistic conditions for negotiations, will continue solving the problem by military means. He was warned long ago. With each passing day, each day which he squanders, the conditions for negotiations will only get worse for him. Similarly, each vile attack on Russian civilians will elicit a stiff response. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Somalia. At the outset, I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Rajan Singham for their comprehensive briefing. Our delegation remains concerned by the continued deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The ongoing hostilities serve only to prolong the suffering and further diminish the prospects for a sustainable peace. We are also troubled by the escalation of military actions affecting civilian areas and critical infrastructure. The protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, and the preservation of critical infrastructure are obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold these principles without exception. We express our regret at the recent attack on the diplomatic premises of the Embassy of the State of Qatar. We call upon the protection of all diplomatic and consular premises as established in the Vienna Convention. We remain convinced that there can be no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the only means to bring this crisis to an end. We note with encouragement the ongoing diplomatic initiatives to secure a just and lasting peace. These diplomatic engagements represent vital steps toward de-escalation, and we hope that they will lay the groundwork for a constructive path forward, including a comprehensive ceasefire. We call upon all sides to seize this diplomatic momentum, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to genuine negotiations. A durable resolution must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and be consistent with the international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. In closing, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. The Ukrainian people and all those affected by this conflict deserve a future defined by peace, prosperity, and dignity. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank the Presidency of Somalia for convening today's meeting, as well as the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, Liberia, and the United Kingdom for their support of Ukraine's emergency request. I'm also grateful to Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Director Raja Singham from OCHA for bearing witness of new horrendous war crimes and crimes against humanity that Russia committed in the last weeks against the civilian population in Ukraine. We praise the leading role of the UN in providing humanitarian aid to those who have suffered. Every time the international community believes that Russia has reached the limits of lies and barbarity, Moscow once again outdoes itself, finding the way to sink even lower and proving that there is no bottom of its criminal intent. Russia deliberately waited until early January, when temperatures in Ukraine plunged to minus 15 degrees Celsius, to unleash some of its most devastating drone and missile strikes against our energy infrastructure, pushing millions of civilians to the very edge of freezing. What we are witnessing these days echoes some of the most infamous precedents in human history, when evil empires sought to break civilian resistance by weaponizing cold, hunger, and darkness. From ancient sieges to medieval winter blockades, history teaches us that deliberately depriving civilians of heat, light, and the means of survival is among the most appalling methods of warfare. The horrific consequence of Russia's brutal attacks was that millions of peaceful Ukrainians, including my family in Kiev, are left for days without electricity, without heating, without water supply, at a time when temperatures at night are approaching minus 20 degrees. This new horrifying wave of terror, also inflicted earlier last week to many other cities across Ukraine, including Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, and Odessa, reflects the determination of Putin to slap in the face of US mediators and continue his barbaric war. The reason why I recall the horrors of the Second World War is not accidental. Ukrainians belong to the biggest victims of Nazism. 80 years ago, that terrible war, which raged on our soil, claimed the lives of up to 10 million Ukrainians. Next month, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine will enter its 13th year and the 5th year since the full-scale invasion of 2022. It has now lasted longer than the war between Third Reich and the Soviet Union, 1,418 days. So when we compare World War II to Russia's military invasion now, the parallels are becoming increasingly shocking, not only in the sheer duration of Moscow's brutal war against Ukrainian statehood, but also in the scale of destruction and, tragically, in the mounting toll of human suffering. The level of Russia's systematic crimes we are witnessing day and night has reached an unprecedented height. This Council can no longer ignore this outrageous war. Every single day that the Security Council fails to act to end Russia's war brings more victims. Distinguished colleagues, apart from the barbaric tactics of scorched earth that Russia's troops are employing against the Ukrainian population, there is another reason why Ukraine requested this emergency meeting. During the night of January 9th, Russia not only launched one of the deadliest strikes of missiles and drones against Ukrainian cities, for the second time Russia employed the so-called Oreshnik, an intermediate-range hypersonic ballistic missile system against my native region of Lviv, situated just a few dozen kilometers from the EU and NATO border. Since this weapon can carry a nuclear payload, such a blatant attack represents a clear threat to the security of the European continent, undermining regional stability and posing serious risks to broader international peace. Russia has spiraled into a new level of escalation. The fact that Russia now attempts, as we just heard, to justify again this cynical strike by referring to a fake attack on a Putin residence that never occurred is just absurd. But there is nothing new in this approach. Russia began its war of aggression against Ukraine under a fake and fabricated pretext. Russia's claim, which is ridiculous, with Putin's residence is reminiscent of the Gleiwitz incident on 31st of August 1939, when Adolf Hitler staged a false flag attack on a radio station to justify invading Poland. The perfidious logic is identical. The aggressor state fabricates a casus belli where none exists. Let me be clear, this so-called attack on Putin's residence is an absolute lie, period. The true purpose of Russia's assault with its alleged Wunderwaffe, Oreshnik, is brutally clear: intimidation of Ukraine's allies and partner. Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and now deputy secretary of the National Security Council, directly confirmed this in his X post, commenting it in a prison-like jargon. I quote, "The ruling European dimwits want a war in Europe after all. It's been said 1,000 times Russia won't accept any European or NATO troops in Ukraine, but no, Macron keeps peddling his pathetic bullshit, Well, come on, this is what you'll get," end quote. And then Medvedev joyfully shared a video of the Oreshnik strike in Lviv region. Putin claims that this high-tech Oreshnik missile cannot be intercepted. This is just a joke. The so-called super weapon he boasts about is little more than just a trinket. Our experts who analyzed the remnants of this missile found a gyroscope of the very same type with which Yuri Gagarin flew into space over 60 years ago. Mr. President, Russia portrays itself and this brutality against Ukraine as a display of power, attempting to threaten international community. Russia wants to sell to this Council and the whole UN family the impression that it is invincible, but this is another illusion. The carefully staged image of strength is nothing but a smoke and mirrors, completely detached from reality. The Russian leadership is like a game player holding the worst possible hand, yet Putin keeps a perfect poker face pretending that he has an ace up his sleeve. In reality, Russia's cards are extremely weak. Russia's position is getting more fragile every day, and its bluff is evident. The Kremlin used to puff off its cheeks and flex its muscle, but it is all just a fig leaf, hiding the weakness of the Russian war machine, which is inevitably approaching its critical point. What Russia tries to project as its strength is in fact nothing else but a manifestation of vulnerability, reflecting its failure to achieve strategic military goals on the battlefield. Distinguished members of the Council, let me present you just a few facts which will demonstrate that Russia is losing this war. It is not a question of if, it is just a question of when. Russia's economic and social foundations are under immense strain. Growth is fully dependent on defense procurement rather than genuine economic productivity. 2025 was a breaking point of Russia's economy, which saw a dramatic shift from short-term wartime growth to long-term economic stagnation. Initially, following the invasion, Russia benefited from high global commodity prices and a spending-fueled boom, but these factors have now disappeared. The combination of weak growth, rising taxes, and reduced revenues points toward a deteriorating economic ability to further finance this war. With reserves depleting and structural damage accumulating, most experts agree that the Russian economy is and will remain at its weakest point since the turbulences of the late 1990s. 2025 showed that Russia's economic growth, driven by wartime spending, cannot be sustained indefinitely. Russia's military production temporarily propped up GDP in the first years after the large-scale invasion, but the economic boost from militarization has now completely faded. In late 2025, the GDP growth slowed to 0.1%. For 2026, the IMF forecasts a very weak growth of the Russian economy, projecting around 0.6% of GDP. It is expected to stagnate with persistently elevated inflation. That underscores the steep slowdown from Russia's 4.3% GDP growth back in 2024, which had been fueled by heavy wartime spending. Such structural stagnation is projected to persist well beyond 2026, due to today's war-driven pressures. Until 2025, growth rested on a sharp rise in state spending, which increased by roughly a quarter in 2024, but this driver disappeared last year, and there is no obvious catalyst to revive growth in 2026. Last year, for the first time since the pandemic, Russia collected less budget revenue than originally planned. When this budget was approved, revenues were set at around $500 billion, but updated forecasts suggest that they will come in closer to $447 billion. This marks a break from the previous 3 years, including 2024, when revenues consistently exceeded initial projections. This led the Kremlin to order higher tax collection to sustain war spending. Tax increases and revenue declines indicate that the war is largely financed by shrinking domestic economic activity rather than robust trade surpluses. Oil and gas. We spoke about this last time, a month ago. These two factors have historically funded between 30 and 40 and 50% of Russia's federal budget and a large share of war financing, but these revenues have fallen at least by a quarter last year. 2026 is likely to bring another year of weak budget incomes for Russia. The World Bank expects a global oil supply surplus to push Brent crude oil prices down from the average of $68 a barrel to around $60 a barrel this year, the lowest level in 5 years. The price of Russian Urals crude have also been trading below historical levels. Independent trackers reported prices even lower in early January this year, with Urals near $35 a barrel, the lowest in many years. Additional pressure on the Russian budget and energy sector is put by new sanctions imposed by the United States last October against its two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Moscow is forced to agree to ever larger discounts on oil, sometimes to more than $30 per barrel. Following the introduction of new US sanctions, Russia's oil and gas revenues in December 25 fell by almost 50% compared to a previous year. While the so-called shadow fleet has helped Russia accumulate up to $100 billion in annual revenue, it has not stopped export revenue declines overall. Increased seizing and sanctioning of such vessels and recent legal actions against them signal even greater constraints ahead. The United States and partners have sanctioned Russian tankers as part of measures targeting the primary source of war funding. As a result, shipments in the week to January 4th fell to 3 million barrels a day, the lowest since August. On the monetary side, the Russian central bank was forced to raise interest rates to a record high of over 20% to curb rapid inflation. This reduced corporate profits as businesses stopped investing. Production in some industries fell sharply and corporate debt rose rapidly. Economists point to the potential of a banking crisis by November 26, caused by the expansion of corporate lending in the first 3 years of the war. Russian bankers themselves sounded the alarm about the growth of problem loans, with some even stating that many companies are in a pre-default state. Russia's reserves and hence its ability to absorb economic shocks look large on paper but are strategically constrained and fragile. As of late 2025, the central bank reports $720 billion in international reserves, yet a large part of them remains frozen in Western jurisdictions. Of the accessible portion, 40% accounts for gold, an asset illiquid under sanctions and difficult to monetize at scale. Russia's National Wealth Fund, the true fiscal buffer for deficits, has been heavily depleted from $145 billion pre-war to now $35 billion by mid-25. Ongoing budget deficits of roughly 3 to 4% of GDP, driven by military spending and weaker energy revenues, mean the fund is being drawn down to plug gaps rather than invest, with credible projections that it could be largely exhausted in 2026 if conditions persist. Economic problems are severely affecting the purchasing power of Russia's population. A recent report by Russian Sberbank showed that consumers began tightening their belts and reduced their spending. Financial difficulties caused by the economic crisis have forced Russians to take out quick loans that they cannot repay. But this war has also created a true demographic shock for Russia. Just imagine this figure. Since Putin began his war in February 2022, there have been over 1.2 million Russian casualties, killed or wounded. Last year, Russia was losing on average 1,200 soldiers a day, or 50 soldiers an hour, or almost 1 soldier per minute. So during this emergency meeting of the Security Council, most probably around 100 Russian soldiers will have lost their lives. These losses have consequences for Russian economy as well. About 70% of its casualties are men aged from 20 to 39, the core male labor and fertility cohort. Simultaneously, around 900 most young, educated Russians have immigrated since 22, removing precisely the workers with the highest productivity and tax contribution. As a result, Russia entered 2026 with an estimated labor shortage of 6.5 million workers, projected to widen to 11 million by 2030. This shrinks the tax base while raising pension, healthcare, and compensation costs, structurally degrading Russia's capacity to finance both a modern economy and a prolonged high-intensity war. These developments create a systematic economic effect which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to cover ongoing war costs without deepening economic pain at home. Sustaining such a protracted, resource-intensive conflict requires consistent, robust revenue streams, and current trends show that these streams are on the verge of collapse in 2026. So it is precisely this catastrophic state of Russia's economy that is driving Moscow to issue ultimatums and use Oreshniks and other ghosts to coerce the international community into accepting its terms for ending the war. It is Russia that finds itself in a zugzwang. Mr. President, let me reiterate, Ukraine will continue to seek peace, a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, based on international law and grounded in the principles of the Charter. Ukraine remains fully committed to the peace process initiated by US President Donald Trump. We commend the mediation efforts of the United States and active diplomatic efforts of our European and other partners that seek to pave the way for genuine peace. Last weeks were marked by an intensive shuttle diplomacy in Florida, in Paris, with personal engagement of President Volodymyr Zelensky. What we see, though, is that Russia deliberately derailing these peaceful initiatives. To conclude, I would first of all appeal to our allies and partners who have been strongly helping Ukraine. All the available air defense systems and missiles in stockpiles must be transferred immediately to protect civilians and energy infrastructure from Russian bombs. We also need long-range weapons to neutralize future attacks. We call upon our allies to introduce additional sanctions and increase economic pressure on Russia, including tougher measures targeting the shadow fleet, further restrict energy revenues as well as Moscow's ability to acquire critical components for weapons production. We also wish to appeal to all those UN member states who have so far remained neutral and continue to claim that sanctions are unacceptable or useless. This is a wrong approach. They are highly effective despite their imperfect implementation. The medicine is working. It is the dose that should be increased. As long as Russia keeps abusing its veto power, blocking the Security Council, coordinated sanctions are the only way to push Moscow towards peace. Mr. President, Russia resembles the Soviet Union in its final years of decline, before it imploded. It is not an expanding superpower, but a rigid, overextended system burdened by unbearable military expenditures and internal decay. No one expected the USSR to crumble overnight, yet it happened. The historic parallels with present-day Russia are strikingly similar. Today's Russia is like a colossus with feet of clay, and it is only a matter of time before this entire house of cards collapses. So our message to Russia is very simple, and I will put it in Russian language, since you have claimed that this language is being prohibited or discriminated in Ukraine. Все, ребятушки, приплыли.
That's it, guys.
Сушите весла.
We're here. Let's dry
И
our
крутите
oars.
лапки. The game is over for you. Very soon, I think.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting promptly in response to yet another escalatory action by the Russian aggressor. I also wish to thank the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and the Director Raja Singham for their valuable briefings. As we all heard, last Friday we witnessed brutal attacks on Ukrainian residential areas and critical infrastructure. The city of Lviv, not far away from the border of my country, Poland, was targeted by Russian intermediate-range ballistic missile called Oreshnik. The systematic nature of Russian attacks demonstrates a deliberate strategy to inflict suffering of the civilian population by targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure and leaving millions of people without electricity and heating in the bitter winter conditions. Poland expresses its full solidarity with Ukraine and the families of the victims. We call on Russia to stop the war immediately. Mr. President, these attacks are being accompanied by a characteristic Russian fog of disinformation. Russian propaganda also today keeps on attempting to justify the strike by claiming it was carried out in response to alleged drone attack on Putin's residence, an incident that we all know has never took place. Mr. President, Russia's deadly strike and disinformation come at the time of intensified US-led diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the war. This conduct is unacceptable, harmful, and deserves the strongest condemnation from the international community. In this context, let me underline 3 points. First, Russia is not interested in achieving peace. As it's clear, the Kremlin and Putin's goals remain unchanged regardless of the peace efforts of the international community, the destruction of Ukraine and its complete capitulation. Russia also seeks to achieve this by discouraging continued international assistance to Ukraine. Under these circumstances, we cannot afford to reduce our support. On the contrary, it is essential to continue providing Ukraine with both military and non-military assistance to strengthen its position in the peace negotiations and to make clear that Russia's ultimate goals cannot be achieved. Therefore, let me underline that those countries that continue to support Russia in any form are directly or indirectly fueling this war. Against the backdrop, sanctions imposed by the European Union, the United States, and the partners are exerting significant pressure on Russia's war economy, as we just heard. Poland supports the adoption of additional restrictive measures. We urge all countries that continue to import Russian oil to cease doing so, and this will contribute to ending the aggression. We also welcome the decisive stance in enforcing sanctions against Russia's illegal trading practices and its use of the so-called shadow fleet. Second, Russia's aggressive stance is responsible for the unprecedented arms buildup in Europe, and this compels countries like Poland to increase defense spending in order to protect their citizens and sovereignty. We would much prefer to allocate these resources to sustainable development and international cooperation. However, Russia leaves us of no choice and continues to divert the world away from the objectives that should unite us all. Third, in addition to the regular threats, Russia is intensifying hybrid attacks across the region and against NATO member states. We call on the Security Council to take this hybrid warfare seriously and to send a clear signal that this dangerous trend cannot be tolerated and must be stopped. That we call the Security Council to prevent any potential regional spillover. Mr. President, Poland will continue its goodwill participation in the peace efforts. At the same time, we will further extend necessary support to Ukraine. We encourage all partners to do the same, for the sake of just and lasting peace and for the future of the international community. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with a statement to be delivered by the European Union. Once again, for the 4th consecutive new year, we are forced to begin the year by condemning Russia's brutality, its violations of international law, including the UN Charter, and its rejection of multiple calls for peace by the UN General Assembly, this Security Council, and the International Court of Justice. Regrettably, even amid the colossal efforts by Ukraine, the United States, and Europe to achieve a just and lasting peace, we're meeting here today because Russia is, contrary to all these international efforts, escalating its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine in an attempt to disrupt the peace process. Russia used the intermediate-range ballistic missile, so-called Oreshnik, against Lviv, in close proximity to the EU and NATO borders, and launched over 200 drones and missiles against the capital Kiev and other cities overnight of the 9th of January, deliberately targeting energy facilities and civilian infrastructure in a bitter cold, and even the diplomatic missions. This is yet another escalation by Russia. The use of a nuclear-capable ballistic missile sets a dangerous precedent that not only threatens the security of Ukraine and Europe, but also undermines global peace and security. The use of such systems increases the risk of escalation and miscalculation. Moreover, Russia's ongoing missile and drone attacks pose grave risks to nuclear safety in Europe. The protective shield over Chernobyl's nuclear reactor has already lost its primary safety functions, as verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency after Russia's attack last year. Mr. President, supported by Belarus, the DPRK, and Iran, but also fueled by shadow fleet tankers' illegal oil trade, and the supply of dual-use technologies, Russia is expanding its aggression, including by engaging in hybrid actions across Europe and elsewhere. The Baltic states, as countries neighboring Russia, that still have vivid memory of what living under Russia's occupation is about, have been providing multifaceted support to the government and people of Ukraine. Reiterate our call on the international community to discontinue all assistance to Russia that enables its aggression. The Baltic states strongly condemn Russia's deliberate attacks on civilian population in Ukraine. We urge Russia to respect its commitments under international humanitarian law and to protect civilians and humanitarian personnel in all circumstances. We reaffirm our full support to Ukraine in standing up to Russia's terror and call on all to increase pressure on Russia to force it to the negotiating table. In line with the UN General Assembly resolution on the return of Ukrainian children as adopted at the 11th Emergency Special Session on the 3rd of December last year, concrete action must now be taken to protect the rights, safety, and well-being of the children of Ukraine, especially those forcibly deported to and illegally adopted in Russia and Belarus, to ensure their safe return and the accountability of perpetrators. We demand full accountability, including implementation of the International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued on the 17th of March of 2023 against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova over allegations of involvement in the war crimes of child abduction during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mr. President, Russia must heed the call for peace by President Trump and the international community, and immediately cease its illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression. The Baltic states reaffirm our unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. As this Council continues to overwhelmingly call for peace in Ukraine, and while sustained diplomatic efforts by the United States, Ukraine, and Europe intensified lately, Russia has yet again to show a genuine will to stop its illegal and unprovoked war of aggression. In the last days, new innocent lives were lost, as deliberate targeting with missiles and drones of Ukrainian civilians and civilian areas continued in violation of international humanitarian law. Millions of Ukrainians were deprived of essential services, including electricity, heating, and water, in the midst of a harsh cold spell as a result of a weaponization of winter. Another foreign diplomatic mission in Kyiv sustained damage, once again demonstrating the reckless nature of these attacks and disregard for international law. Romania joins the UN Secretary General and other Council and UN member states in strongly condemning the continued Russian targeted attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including strikes in Kyiv and Lviv region, which are unacceptable under international law and must stop. We reiterate our solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and we remain determined in supporting Ukraine in ensuring accountability and justice for these brutal attacks. President, there is no justification to respond with escalation and terror against civilians while the whole world expects now Russia to match Ukraine's proven commitment and engagement in peace efforts. The use of an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile against civilian infrastructure, as well as in close proximity with the borders of the European Union and NATO, was escalatory and constitutes a serious threat to regional international security and stability. And this is not what is expected from a responsible permanent member of the Security Council. Instead, it is high time to put an end to this senseless war of aggression. Intense diplomatic efforts by the United States, Ukraine, and the European Union in the last weeks brought progress in pursuing the goal of a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. An immediate ceasefire, to which Ukraine already committed, remains a significant first step. And it remains imperative to keep up pressure to stop this war, including through sanctions and concerted action against Russia's shadow fleet. Security in the Black Sea remains of concern for us as well, as Russia stepped up attacks on ports in the Odessa region. Alongside its partners in the coalition of the willing, Romania remains engaged in ongoing diplomatic efforts led by the United States towards a just and lasting peace. Robust and workable security guarantees for Ukraine is the element that will define such a peace in face of an aggressor with a historical record of relapsing into breaches of international law. We informed extensively this Council about Romania's comprehensive efforts in supporting Ukraine and addressing the global consequences of Russia's aggression. And Romania will continue to bring its contributions to securing peace and reconstruction in Ukraine. We reiterate our continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The achievement of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace needs to be in line with the UN Charter and those principles. Peace must not reward the aggressor. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Romania for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, President. And thank you to the Somali Presidency for convening this meeting. Thank you to the briefers for their updates. And also allow me to use this opportunity to warmly welcome the Council's new members. Colleagues, we meet as Russia continues to escalate its war of aggression against Ukraine in ever more brutal ways. In recent days, and while peace talks intensify, Russia has intensified its own attacks in Ukraine, cynically striking civilian energy, heating, and water infrastructure in the midst of winter, and deliberately targeting civilians, including women, children, and humanitarian workers. Last Thursday, Russia struck Ukraine with a reported 242 drones and 36 missiles. Among these, you've heard this many times in this room today, an Oreshnik hypersonic missile targeting Lviv, just 60 kilometers from the Polish border, where it hit residential buildings and energy infrastructure. The Qatari embassy was also damaged. And Russia has also significantly stepped up attacks on the city and port of Odessa, a crucial hub for global food security. This, colleagues, is unacceptable escalation and a further sign, if any were needed, that Russia has no interest in ending its war of aggression and stopping the killing. The European Union recalls that intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks, constitute violations of international humanitarian law and do amount to war crimes. And this, colleagues, this violence, this open aggression, this war has been going on and on and on for 4 years. As we approach the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, an illegal and unprovoked military action, all efforts should be geared towards achieving a just and lasting peace. Russia appears to believe that it can justify its actions and, at the same time, pretend to be committed to peace. It cannot. And as this were not enough, it complements this charade by continuing to spread false claims, including that Ukraine allegedly attacked a Putin residence, to distract attention from its years-long and escalating brutality. The reality, plain and simple for all to see, is that while Russia escalates, Ukraine is committed to peace. It has agreed to an immediate ceasefire already nearly a year ago, and continues every day to advocate for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in line with the decisions by the General Assembly and the UN Charter. The reality is that peace talks have been intensifying and have made progress in spite of Russia's intransigence. The European Union will sustain these diplomatic efforts with Ukraine towards a just and lasting peace in accordance with international law, together with the United States and other partners. Chair, we urge Russia to agree to a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire, and call on all members of this Council to rally behind this objective and to push Moscow to engage in meaningful negotiations. The UNSC should exert maximum diplomatic pressure on the only country that openly violates Resolution 2774 to stop the killing. Third countries and actors and entities therein that continue enabling Russia's war of aggression must stop doing so. We condemn the continued military support provided by Iran, by Belarus, by the DPRK, and urge all countries, including all members of this Council, to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression. Dear colleagues, for peace to be just and lasting, borders must not be changed by force. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Any future agreement must respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And it must guarantee Ukraine's long-term security and ability to defend itself. In this regard, the EU and member states are ready to contribute to robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine, notably through the coalition of the willing and in cooperation with the United States. This will include supporting Ukraine's ability to deter aggression and defend itself effectively. President, I close by reaffirming the European Union's continued and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. In coordination with our allies, we will continue to pursue an immediate ceasefire and a just and lasting peace, and to provide comprehensive political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and to its people. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.